Hello and welcome, kings, queens, and those in between. It's your boy Sultan Skinny, lord of all that is lean and politically unclean. Today is International Women's Day. It's a lot shorter than Black History Month, but it definitely has a lot more to talk about. You see, for the vast majority of human history, women have been disadvantaged in societies simply because of the gender they were born into. This discrimination can be seen in how laws, society, and specifically men view and treat women. The last 100 years or so have seen women make exceptional strides in fighting against the power of the patriarchy. But work still needs to be done, and this Soviet holiday is an annual reminder of that. While the fight for equal women's rights is winning globally, there are some places in the world that really need improvement. The Global Gender Gap Report is a study that measures the disparity between men and women in different countries. It bases its ranking on a combination of factors that include economic participation, health, educational attainment, and political empowerment. According to the 2020 edition of the report, the countries that have the largest gaps unfavorable to women were mostly part of the Islamic world. While there are exceptions like Albania, Bangladesh, and Kazakhstan who all scored above the global average, Islamic society has nonetheless garnered a pretty bad reputation in the eyes of feminists. Or so you would think. It turns out that many feminists, both Muslim and non-Muslim alike, have this idea that the Islamic religion has nothing to do with the gender inequality we see from the Islamic world. In fact, many of these Islamic feminists even go so far as to say that the religion of Islam actually empowers women and promotes gender equality. The data seems to suggest otherwise, but these are Muslim feminists, so we should be listening to them, right? They know more what it's like to be a woman in Islamic society, so we should just take their word for it, right? Well, you see, my friends, being the slick sultan that I am very much in tune with what the ladies want. And what every woman wants is a guy explaining their problems. So that's what we're going to be doing today. In this episode, your boy Sultan Skinny is going to lay out why everything these so-called Islamic feminists say is nothing more than just absolute nonsense. Now, before I mansplain my way into debunking the lies of Islamic feminism, I think it's important for us to understand where these ladies are coming from. Most of human history has been dominated by stories of great men, whether they be kings, generals, scholars, or prophets. But the history of Islam actually has its fair share of female leads as well. Muhammad's first wife and mentor, Khadija, is perhaps the most famous of these figures. Khadija was about twice the age of her husband, and prior to meeting him had already established herself as a successful caravan merchant. Khadija was also the first person to believe in Muhammad's revelation, something that even the Prophet himself was doubtful of. She is remembered in Islamic history as being the first Muslim, and was perhaps the most influential person in the Prophet Muhammad's life. Muhammad's third and youngest wife, Aisha, is also cited as a very important figure in Islamic history. Being the youngest of Muhammad's wives, by a long shot, Aisha had the best memory of the Prophet, and is credited for writing over 2,000 hadiths about the Prophet's life and Islamic theology. Aisha even led an army into battle to challenge the Caliphate of Ali, which has given her kind of a bad rap in Shia circles, but an influential one nonetheless. In fact, women in general were very important in the transmitting of Islamic learning and history. While the men went out to kill each other, women were busy raising the next generation of Muslims, making them instrumental in the development of Islamic law and stories. Muslim women have a very rich history in Islamic education, with many madrasas being founded by women scholars and sultanas. Women were also very involved in the markets and public affairs of Islamic economies, as they could buy, sell, own, and inherit property. Marriage in Islamic society is less of a status and more of a contract. Women do not have to adopt their husband's name. In fact, it's discouraged. And in the case of a divorce, Muslim women were entitled to their dowry and all other property earned and inherited from the marriage. As basic of a right as it sounds now, giving women the legal right to own property without the interference of men was a revolutionary concept in the medieval world. To give you an idea of how revolutionary this freedom was, the idea of married women being able to keep their property after a divorce was only introduced into British common law in 1882. In comparison to the rest of the medieval world, Muslim women were definitely exercising a lot more rights than their counterparts. But that doesn't necessarily make Islam a feminist religion. You see, while promoting education, property rights, and strong female characters are definitely a good place to start, the ultimate goal of feminism is to achieve gender equality, both legally and socially. And that's something that Islam just doesn't support. The Quran is believed by Muslims to be the divine word of God that was spoken through the Prophet Muhammad and preserved in the memory and accounts of those around him. It is the fundamental text that Islamic law, rituals, and practice revolve around. So, looking into how God speaks about women can give us a very good understanding about how his followers view them. Women are mentioned very often in the Quran, so much so that there is an entire chapter dedicated to them, called Al-Nisa, literally translating into the woman. This chapter is important in Islamic legal matters as it discusses inheritance, marriage, and the role both men and women have in society. If somebody wants to see whether or not Islam is a feminist religion, this is the chapter to read up on. The first thing one might notice when reading this chapter is that the Quran is speaking to the men about how they should treat their wives, daughters, and women in general. If you fear that you shall not be able to deal justly with the orphans, marry women of your choice, 2 or 3 or 4. But if you fear that you shall not be able to deal justly with them, then only one, or that of which your right hand possesses. That will be suitable to prevent you from doing injustice. And give the women their dower as a free gift. But if they, of their own good pleasure, rent any part of it to you, take it and enjoy it with good cheer. This verse not only permits men to marry more than one woman, along with a slave girl if he does please, but it also serves as a reminder of just who the Quran is talking to. Men are clearly the ones who are being addressed here as the readers, and although the chapter is on the subject of women, the Quran treats women as just that, a subject for men to discuss. While the Quran definitely guarantees the right for women to inherit, own, and control their property, this right is not distributed equally. Allah directs you as regards your children's inheritance. To the male, a portion equal to that of 2 females. If only daughters, 2 or more, their share is 2/3 of the inheritance. If only one, her share is half. So even in the case of that great progressive right to own property, women are still receiving the shorter end of the stick. Sons are to inherit twice as much as daughters simply because of the gender they were assigned to at birth. That is the literal definition of gender inequality. And it's not just property rights. Even in the criminal court, men possess far more legal advantages than women. In the case of promiscuity, one of the worst offenses in Islam, the Quran writes, "If any of your women are guilty of lewdness, take the evidence of 4 witnesses from amongst you against them. And if they testify, confine them to houses until death do claim them, or Allah ordain them in some other way." While women can be sentenced to death for sleeping with someone else other than their husbands, Muslim men are permitted to have up to 4 wives at a time and have more lenient punishments regarding the same crime of promiscuity. If 2 men among you are guilty of lewdness, punish them both. If they repent, amend, leaving them alone, for Allah is oft returning and most merciful. So as you can see, the Quran is definitely not the most gender equal rulebook. In fact, the Quran actually justifies the legal disparities between the genders by saying the following: men are the protectors and maintainers of women, because Allah has given one more strength than the other, and because they support them from their means. Therefore, the righteous women are devoutly obedient, and guard in the husband's absence what Allah would have them guard. Obviously, this verse shows us that the Quran does not support the idea of men and women being legally, socially, or even biologically equal in any way. God has given men more strength and thus the responsibility of maintaining the women. Women, on the other hand, are to be devoutly obedient to their husbands because of that extra strength. And if a woman isn't obedient to her husband, well, let's just continue the rest of this verse, shall we? As to those women on whose part you fear disloyalty and ill conduct, admonish them, refuse to share their beds, and beat them. My Quran actually goes out of its way to recommend in brackets that the beating should be done lightly, because that just makes things so much better. Anyway, it's pretty clear that the Quran does not support anything that remotely resembles feminism. Men and women are explicitly depicted as unequal in nature, and the law applies to them unequally. So that should be the end of the discussion, right? Well, look here, Sultan, Muslim feminists will point out. There is a great diversity in Islamic countries. You can see that diversity on this gender gap report. Albania is a Muslim country, and it's scored right between Canada and the UK. Bangladesh is a Muslim country, and it beat the US and Luxembourg. Kazakhstan is a Muslim country, and it's scored better than Italy. Clearly, this disparity of women's rights in the Muslim world is not because of Islam itself. It obviously depends on the culture of the country, and not the religion of its population. How else would you explain this diversity? The argument that culture, rather than religion, affects the status of women in the Islamic world is a very common one used by Islamic feminists, because it makes us look at the culture of an individual country instead of looking at the actual teachings of Islam. So how does this argument hold up in reality? Is there a correlation between the culture of a people and its treatment of women, as opposed to the religion? Well, let's take a look at our Islamic outliers and see what's going on. Albania, Bangladesh, and Kazakhstan are very different countries, with very different cultures, customs, languages, and history. Other than their shared religion, what these three very different countries share in common is a secular government. Islam plays a very limited role in the public offices and courts of these countries, with Islamic law only ever being referenced, if ever, in the case of marriage, divorce, and inheritance. You see, Islam is more than just a religion. It's also a political institution. And whenever a country derives the law of the land from Islam, the rights of women are restricted to the point of second-class status, not just socially, but also legally. A perfect example of this is what happened in the country of Iran. Under the rule of the secular Pahlavi Shah, women's rights in Iran were greatly expanded. In 1963, women in Iran had achieved suffrage and were able to hold political offices, attain an education, and under the family protection law, enjoyed equal rights in marriage, divorce, and child custody. The act also raised the minimum age for marriage to be 18 and had essentially outlawed the practice of polygamy from Iranian society. This being said, however, the secular regime maintained the age-old tradition of telling women what to wear. In an attempt to make Iran more westernized and thus modernized, Reza Shah passed a law known as Kashf-e-Hijab in 1936, which was essentially a ban on all Islamic head coverings. In a country where the majority of the population was Muslim, this was clearly an issue. But the Shah forcefully implemented this rule, to the point that many women just stayed home in order to not be humiliated or convicted for wearing a garment of their faith. The ban would be dropped by Reza Shah's heir, Muhammad Reza Shah, but there remained a social stigma around wearing Islamic head coverings, with more revealing Western-style dresses being promoted as the new normal in Iranian society. This repression of Islamic tradition in a mostly Islamic society would result in the 1979 Islamic Revolution, in which the government of the secular Shah would be replaced by a theocracy led by Ayatollah Khomeini. Many Iranian women were actually at the forefront of the Islamic Revolution, marching in the traditional chador as a symbol of protest against the Western-backed monarchy. But despite all the female participation, the revolution ultimately fell under the control of men. The Islamic Republic of Iran drafted a new constitution and legal code that derived its jurisprudence from Islamic law. For women, this meant placing more of an emphasis in becoming mothers than working professionals. In the early years of the Islamic Republic, obtaining an education and pursuing a career for women became a lot more difficult, as their social obligation was now to the home. The veil became mandatory by law and was enforced by moral police. The Family Protection Act was repealed, with polygamy once again being normalized and the minimum age for marriage changing from 18 to 9. These kinds of laws would be relaxed after the death of Ayatollah Khomeini, but women remain legally discriminated against in the Islamic Republic, with women even being banned from attending men's sporting events in stadiums. This drastic shift of women's rights in Iran was not the result of culture, but rather of politics. It is not a coincidence that after the government changed from a secular regime to an Islamic theocracy, women's rights deteriorated. It should therefore not come to a surprise that the governments most influenced by Islamic doctrine tend to be the lowest scoring countries on the gender gap report. Contrary to what Islamic feminists would tell you, the fact is that Islam is not a feminist religion. A simple reading of the Quran shows us this. Countries that base their legal codes off Islamic doctrine are notorious for being the worst countries for women. Islam, as a religion in both text and practice, restricts the empowerment of women. It's a sad reality for Muslim women and so-called Islamic feminists, but it remains a reality nonetheless. Me being a cartoon and a sultan of my own domain, this isn't an issue for me to solve. At the end of the day, it's up to Muslims, as representatives of the faith, to decide whether or not their religion should continue to be this way. So to all the Muslims out there who are watching this and taking issue with how their religion is being represented, all I ask you is this: what are you going to do about it? Next episode, we dive into the violent world of the Crusades, highlighting the life of one of Islam's most famous leaders, Salahuddin. We will explore the world he grew up in and understand why he is not only one of Islam's most renowned figures, but also the European ideal of what it means to be chivalrous.